Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm Jeff Margolis, president of the American Veterans of Israel Legacy Corporation. Through our organization, successor to the AVI, American Veterans of Israel, we are dedicated to the story, people, and legacy of the Machal, the Nave Chutz La'aretz, the foreign fighters who fought in Israel's 1948 War of Independence, and without whom, in the opinion of many historians, there would not be an independent state of Israel today. I welcome you to the 54th annual Mickey Marcus Memorial Program, the first and hopefully only one to be held solely through the internet. A regular practice is to have a very much live event at the West Point Chapel, followed by a graveside memorial featuring important representatives of the State of Israel and others. But as West Point is closed to visitors, our committee, Cy Spiegelman, Donna Parker, and Rafi Marom, determined that we needed some marking of the event, even if we couldn't appear together as we would have hoped. So with the invaluable technical expertise of communications director, great title, Ben Margolis, a special video presentation has been prepared. Now, if you're on this call, my guess is you know who Mickey Marcus was, but let me just take 1 minute and talk about David Daniel Mickey Marcus, born in 1901, died in June 1948. U.S. Army Colonel and principal architect of the U.S. military's World War II civil affairs policies, including the organization of war crimes trials in Germany and Japan. Fought in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, becoming Israel's first modern general, Aluf, and his nom de guerre was Stone, so Aluf Stone, very tragically killed by friendly fire. He was portrayed by Kirk Douglas in the 1966 movie Cast a Giant Shadow, which focused on Mickey's role in the War of Independence. We hope you enjoy these highlights of programs past, but before the video starts, I must report the loss of two very prominent Machal this past year. Ralph Lowenstein, past president of AVI and AVI archivist, and Paul Kay, one of the first Navy SEALs, a stalwart of the Aliyah Bet, the ships that took the remaining handful of Jews from Europe to then Palestine. And next year, God willing, May 1st, 2022, we will be together again live and have an opportunity to properly honor these two great heroes and stalwarts of the American Veterans of Israel. So I hope you enjoy the video, and thank you so much for participating.
Okay. I am Cy Spiegelman, Vice President of the American Veterans of Israel. I am one of the volunteers who served in the Israel War of Independence. I served on the IDF outpost in the Bet Shan Valley. American Veterans of Israel Legacy Corporation, AVILC, is the organization served among the 5,000 volunteers, men and women, Jews and non-Jews. The volunteers were known as Machal, the Hebrew acronym standing for Volunteers from Abroad. They served in virtually every unit of the fledgling Israeli armed forces, confronting the invading armies of 5 surrounding Arab countries. The Machal support was vital in helping Israel prevail in the War of Independence. The Americans risked both their lives and their citizenship when they joined the fight. 124 of the volunteers gave their lives, among them 41 Americans and Canadians. The highest ranking American Machal volunteer was Colonel David Mickey Marcus. We know him as Mickey Marcus, plain and simple, a West Point graduate who served with distinction in the U.S. Armed Forces during the Second World War. He was recruited at the end of 1947 as military advisor to David Ben-Gurion and the underground Haganah Defense Forces, later named IDF, Israel Defense Forces. In a tragic mishap, he was killed on June 11, 1948. All those whose lives he touched during the 200 days he was involved in Israel's struggle for survival and independence were in awe of his multifaceted, magnetic personality, quick grasp of situations, phenomenal memory, and enormous capacity for work. They praise his courage and his humanity, his integrity and his unwavering optimism, and above all, his ability to inspire confidence. He laid the basis for essential changes in the nascent Israel Defense Forces, the IDF. The highlight of the ABILC activities has been the annual memorial service held at West Point to honor and perpetuate the memory of Aloof General David Mickey Marcus and the other 40 North American volunteers who gave their lives in the struggle to create a Jewish state. This event, initiated by the early ABI, with the involvement of the Jewish chapel at West Point, was conducted for 53 years and interrupted by the pandemic in 2003 and the current year, 2021. Plans are now in progress to resume the memorial service on May 1, 2022 at the West Point Jewish Chapel and the Aloof Marcus graveside. This year, we are pleased to be able to share this virtual Mickey Marcus celebratory program based on our memorial events of the past years. I speak for all Machaonis when I say we look forward to see you next year at West Point. Thank you.
His name was Mickey, but he fought like David. This was Mickey Marcus.
This is how most Americans who know of Colonel David Mickey Marcus picture him. Kirk Douglas in the 1966 film Cast a Giant Shadow. The film was a passion project for Douglas, and he recruited a star-studded cast that included John Wayne, Yul Brynner, Frank Sinatra, and Angie Dickinson to help tell the story of the State of Israel's first general, an American who gave up his U.S. Army commission to fight for a Jewish homeland in 1948, and whose death by friendly fire in June of that year has not diminished a long legacy that is commemorated to this day. The Jewish Channel recently journeyed to one of those commemorations, a memorial service held at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, from which Marcus graduated in 1924 and where he is now buried. Among those who spoke at the service was Jewish Colonel Glenn Goldman.
Mickey Marcus is, in my opinion, an incredible role model of what it means to be a soldier, a mensch, if you will. As his gravestone says, he was a soldier for humanity. So I came to West Point as a cadet myself, and he's buried here at the West Point Cemetery. Honestly, I'm ashamed to admit I did not know that much about him when I was a cadet.
That changed when a friend gave Goldman a copy of Ted Berkman's 1962 book about Marcus, Cast a Giant Shadow, while Goldman was serving as a captain in Operation Desert Storm.
He was a friend of mine at West Point, and we used to have pretty deep conversations about religion, about the world, about our faith, and he cared a lot about me and sent me this book. So I read it, and since then I think Mickey Marcus has been a personal role model for me.
The example Marcus set with his American career before his Israeli service is also a source of inspiration for West Point Dean of the Academic Board, Brigadier General Timothy Traynor.
Mickey Marcus, what's so special about him as a West Point graduate is that he was a servant of both the Army and the nation, and two nations and two armies when you think about it. And that's what West Point graduates, they are called to serve throughout their lifetime. Throughout a lifetime of service to the Army, but at some point, that service is going to end in the Army, and we ask them to continue to serve the nation.
Marcus served as an assistant U.S. attorney in New York City during the 1930s, and later as commissioner of New York City's Department of Corrections. During World War II, Marcus served various posts in the Army and as part of the D-Day invasion force, joining paratroopers who jumped into France, despite having no prior parachute training. Just another example of the daring character that prompted David Ben-Gurion to approach Marcus for a leadership role in the Israeli army, according to American Veterans of Israel Legacy Corporation President Jeffrey Margolis.
And his nom de guerre, his name in war, was Aluf Stone. Aluf means general in Hebrew, and stone was, I guess, what they felt about him, that he was made of stone. He was so strong. It's so fascinating. Not only that, he's buried here at West Point. We're going to go to the graveside. His tombstone has a dedication from the government of Israel. So this is wild. This is beyond belief.
That goes for Marcus's relatives as well. Great-grandniece Lalit Marcus attended the West Point Memorial and talked about Mickey's status within his extended family.
So when I was a kid, I felt the way about Uncle Mickey that some people feel about Elijah at Pesach. You know, he was this mythical figure in our family. We talked about him all the time. I think the part that I didn't understand is that I didn't realize other people thought he was famous. You know, I grew up in an area where there weren't other Jewish kids. There wasn't a big Jewish community. And it wasn't until I got older and I went to Israel for the first time when I was on Birthright, I found out all these other people had heard of my Uncle Mickey, and he really was as famous as everybody said he was.
Lalit added that a yearly service like this one helps bring the extended Marcus family closer, thanks to their famous relative who was buried beside his wife, Emma.
We don't actually all get to see each other very often, and especially since Mickey and Emma didn't have children of their own, we're all nieces and nephews and grandnieces and grandnephews, so we're not necessarily close during the rest of the year. And this is a real treat for us because not only do we all get to see each other and catch up, but the fact that there are people here who have served our country, who have served Israel, in some cases who have served both, it's a real treat, and I love to hear their stories.
One story about Emma Marcus regards a printed piece of her husband's legacy.
I'm fascinated by the way that everyone talks about the women behind the men. And I think Emma was a pretty incredible woman in her own right, in as much as she supported any man. Emma lived the rest of her life. She taught school. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Flatbush that she stayed in for the rest of her life. And she had a giant poster of Kirk Douglas in costume as her husband hanging up in her living room.
And what of Marcus's legacy for the two nations he served? Traynor says his burial site holds the answer.
It shows the connection, the strong bonds and connections between the United States and Israel. And in that, West Point was part of the founding of this country, and Mickey Marcus was part of the founding of the Israeli nation. And I think there's a significance in the connection between those two.
Reporting from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point for the Jewish Channel, I'm Christian Needon.
But I think I can speak for all the Machal, for all the 5,000 who served, that for us it was a privilege. It was a privilege to fight for the state of Israel and to help create the state of Israel. And I know that it will continue to exist for thousands of years. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Ralph Lowenstein, and despite your doubts about it, I am a veteran of the War of Independence. I may not look like it. In fact, I proudly wear the ribbon of the War of Independence victory. And as a bit of trivia, you might see on my particular ribbon that only Mahal and those who served, Israelis who served prior to the War of Independence, have a victory ribbon that has a special thing, a Jewish star in the middle of the victory ribbon itself. You'll see that on mine. Not many people alive today have that. And to Ambassador Dayan, thank you so much for being here and presenting the certificate from the President of Israel. We deeply appreciate that. And all you visitors from Israel, from the police forces, military, we welcome you into our midst as well. In 1955, when I was a 25-year-old reporter for the El Paso Times, I was sent to interview the storied and famous Yigal Allon, who was a famous leader of Palmach forces in the War of Independence, a politician also, who was making a tour of the United States. I was working as a reporter for the El Paso Times at the time, as a photographer also, and they knew that I had served in the Israeli army, so they sent me to interview Yigal Allon. While I was interviewing him, I mentioned what I considered a trivial job that I had as a private in the rear ranks, as a driver of half-tracks of Zachal in the 79th Armored Regiment, which has become a storied regiment in that time, but it was brand new in the days when I served in it. And if I look a little bit young to you to be a veteran of that war, I looked even younger, of course, in 1948, and I quickly became known in the regiment as Hayeled. They didn't know my name at all, but they called me Hayeled, and that was my name for the rest of the time. I was actually 18 years old, but looked maybe 16 or 14, I suppose. Something I've lived through all my life. Anyway, when I mentioned and I used the word trivial, contribution to the War of Independence, Yigal Allon replied to me, "No, Ralph, it was not trivial. When we saw the men and women of Mahal, we knew we were not alone." And those words have stuck with me because Israelis are not alone. 92% of all the Jews in the world now, you may not realize it, but 92% of all the Jews in the world alive today live in either Israel or the United States. And the fact that we are supporters of Israel, and actually surveys have shown certainly more than 90% of all these Jews, whatever you might read in the newspapers, are supportive of Israel. It's extremely important that we teach our children and our friends about the value of Israel as an ally. Mickey Marcus, whom we will honor this afternoon, was actually the first American officer of command rank who volunteered to serve in the Israeli army in 1948. Of all the generals and colonels, he was actually the only one that we know of. The others were afraid of losing that citizenship. We were all certainly concerned about that, that we might lose our citizenship, but especially those graduates of West Point and high military officers were concerned about that, but not Mickey Marcus. Mickey Marcus had the bravery to volunteer to work with Israel. He wrote the first manual for soldiers, and he wrote them from memory. He didn't have even the manual itself, but he sat down in a few nights and wrote a manual for the soldiers from memory that was then used in the Israeli army. And the other thing that Mickey Marcus did was, up until that time, Israel really only worked from battalion levels, worked as battalion, company and battalion levels, and Mickey Marcus knew that in order to defeat the Arabs, Israel had to learn to work at battalion levels, combining battalions to fight at the same time and fight in certain military operations. And of course, he was the first person, we believe, to be of Aluf rank, because he commanded 3 battalions that led the fight to restore communication from, say, Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And he was killed by a sentry in the process of doing that. So it's a tragic death, but those things happen. But we honor him because he was the one who had the guts, the courage, and the knowledge to represent Americans and help Israel at a time of great need.
This is also the same spirit that prevails in Tzahal, in the IDF, the spirit that you brought with you when you came to volunteer for the independence of the State of Israel. The same spirit of volunteering, the same self-confidence in Netzach Israel, in the eternity of the Jewish people, that led Mickey Marcus and you and your fathers and grandfathers, your parents and grandparents, to come to Israel to fight for Israel independence, is the same spirit that leads every single Chayal and Chayelet, soldier, men and women in the IDF. They draw inspiration from your volunteering in order to fight for Israel's independence. It is remarkable in our lone soldiers that, replicating your example, come to Israel to fight for independence. We have the honor to have here with us Rabbi Mordechai Rindenau. 5 of his children came to Israel to fight for the security of Israel and the Jewish people, and one of them, Shlomo Zichrono Livracha, paid the ultimate price. But every single Israeli soldier draws inspiration from your example. And we can't thank you enough, not only for what you did 70, 71 years ago, but for your contribution, indirect contribution every single day for the security of the State of Israel. I'm honored to read now a letter by the Prime Minister of the State of Israel. Dear friends, I send warm greetings from Jerusalem as you gather at West Point to honor the memory of Colonel David Mickey Marcus, an outstanding and courageous veteran who served with distinction in the United States Army and in the nascent Israel Defense Forces. More than 4,400 Jewish and non-Jewish volunteers came from 56 different countries to fight for Israel's independence. Many of these brave men and women, Mickey included, sacrificed their lives for the survival of the newly established Jewish state. As we mark the 71st anniversary of Israel's independence, we remember and celebrate the important contribution of heroes like Colonel Marcus, who used his extensive military knowledge and experience to build the Burma Road to Jerusalem, breaking the crippling siege of our capital. I commend the Mickey Marcus Memorial Program and the American Veterans of Israel Legacy Corporation for their important work, and I wish you all a memorable and enjoyable event. Sincerely, Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of the State of Israel. Thank you very much.
אתה איתי לשני מחנות rachamim shoichein b'avrayamim ametem nuchanechayna ala kanefei hashechina v'malos kedoyashim utahorim kazor harakia mazirim es nishmas David ben Mordechai shehalach le'olamaho Ma'avor she'nachnu metfalelim b'yad hazkaras nishamaso Began Hayden Tehei Menuchaso Lachein Bal Harachamim Yastirehu B'Seiser Kenafav Li'olamim V'yitzrar Mitzrar HaChayim Es Nishmaso Adonai hunach laso v'yanuach b'shalom al mishkavo v'nomar amen.
Yiskadal v'yiskadash shemei rabah Valamad Yivrachim say, V'yamim Lavim say, V'chayei Echon, V'yom Echon, V'chayei D'chol Beis Yisrael, V'agalah, V'zman Karim, Yidru Amen. Yisrorach, Yishabach, Yisroar, Yisramach, Yisaseh, Yishador, Yisalem, Yishalom, Shemei, Yishar, Le'elah, Mitkol, V'rachasa, V'shirasa, V'shpatasa, V'nachasa, V'avira, V'yolma, V'yidru Amen. Yahei, Shlomo Rabba, Shemaya, V'chayim, V'aleinu, V'yalchol, Yisrael, V'yidru Amen. Shalom, V'yolma, V'yad,